one of the things that is very interesting about the Congolese Solidarity Campaign, it's a popular organization, it's not an NGO, it's not a professional organization, it's an organization of Congolese people in Durban, is that they elaborate a very political critique, about the situation in the Congo that goes back to slavery, colonialism, Lumumba, through to the present moment. And they are trying to engage South Africans on a political basis and to develop a shared set of ideas about how it is that some people are considered disposable in this world. You can be a poor person who is born in, I don't know, Ngongoma or Babanango or Flagstaff, and you can be disposable in Durban, just as some people in the Congo are disposable. They're trying to elaborate a common critique. So it's a great pity that they weren't able to come. And the film that they've made themselves shows the day-to-day work that they're doing with Abahlali Basanjolo. So it's attending each other's meetings, holding combined events, and a lot of work explaining the situation in the Congo to South Africans, explaining the history, explaining why things are the way they are. But we will get them back. They really wanted to come and meet Professor Wambadi Wamba because they are very well aware of his work, and they really wanted to have some discussion. So it's a great pity that it didn't work out. So what we decided to do is to have two panels with two people each. So we'll have Michael and Professor Diawamba now, and then we'll have Tupelo and Fezi in the second session. We've got the Vice Chancellor, Professor Mabazela, coming here at 11, is it? 11:30. So that's fixed, so we have to work around that. But it'll give us a little more time. And I don't think we should worry about the fact that at the moment there aren't too many people here. I mean, I think we should take it seriously insofar as it shows that there just isn't that much interest in one of the most pressing issues of our time. I mean, the army is going door to door in downtown Port Elizabeth, rooting out people who they think are foreign, sometimes people who are married to people from other countries. It's entirely appalling. The state is mobilizing a logic that conflates being a migrant with being a criminal. They are trying to develop a form of nationalism that is exclusionary and authoritarian and based on a kind of organized, bureaucratized sadism, actually, which has certain clear parallels with certain aspects of the logic of fascism, and we can't shy away from that reality. But, middle-class South Africa as a whole, just doesn't care that much. If what is happening here now was happening in many countries in the world, the churches, progressive academics, left-wing people would be on the streets. We don't see that happening here. What we do know, though, is that in 2008 and now, grassroots activists, when they're well organized, have been able to effectively take real positions against xenophobia and keep people safe. It happened in 2008, it happened now. It's not just Abahlali and Durban. It's been other social movements like the Landless People's Movement, the anti-eviction campaign, small groups. I read something recently about a small group in Johannesburg called Abahlali Bassa Freedom Park. They're not related to Abahlali and Durban. People taking real action to defend their communities. And that's very, very difficult political work. It puts people at risk. It puts movements at risk. If you're a poor person in South Africa, you already have a question mark over your connection and your belonging in the nation. And people are struggling for things like land and houses and services and the right to be participants in development. And when you have that kind of question mark over your place in the nation, that's very, very difficult. So to choose to say we are going to be in solidarity with these people from the Congo or Malawi or Mozambique is something that really can put your own struggle at risk. But, the discourse around xenophobia is absolutely dominated when it's pseudo-progressive by the human rights paradigm, which turns it into a set of legal rights, which doesn't take cognizance of the fact that what has actually worked is progressive grassroots organization. So I think Michael's point about us needing to really rethink the way people speak about this problem is very serious. It might be a small group of people here, but you all are really important people, and people who are going to be really important in this society. And the quality of a political and intellectual discussion is, in certain circumstances, more significant than the quantity of the people who participate in it. There were, I don't know how many people fit into the Eden Grove Blue on Monday night. How many people fit into that venue? A few hundred for sure. We had the former president say the problem of xenophobia is a problem of the poor, and the solution is for the state to step up its regulation of migrants. So a lot of people there, the discussion about it was actually pure art, to be honest. There was no recognition whatsoever of the fact that we have a state that is actively and ruthlessly xenophobic. It was simply ignored. So I think a small discussion, and to have someone as eminent as Professor Diawamba here is an honor. It's not necessarily a bad thing. A lot of really important things have started on that basis. We'll begin with Michael, then Professor Diawamba. We'll have a little more time than we thought, so hopefully we can have a rich discussion. I would really encourage you all to participate as much as possible. It's an opportunity for us all to learn and clarify our thinking on this issue. So, Michael, we'll start with you.
Thank you very much, Richard, and thank you for coming. What I thought I was going to do is to talk about rethinking xenophobia and thinking it as a form of politics. Like Richard said, I think we have to start by understanding xenophobia as politics, not as psychology, not as a problem of the poor or poverty, not as criminality, but as a question of politics. That doesn't mean to say that, of course, it isn't also psychologically located in people's attitudes. In fact, overwhelmingly, all the attitude surveys in South Africa show consistently an overwhelming majority of the population is having xenophobic attitudes. However, these may be measured. And one of the frustrations that people who have a sociological bent faced is that they couldn't work out what a xenophobic profile might look like. In other words, hey, please come, sit down. Nice to meet you. You're talking later, so you can relax now. Chapelo is from Abakhlal, who's just arrived hot off the plane. He didn't miss it. No. So, as I was saying, made it. It's a big sigh of relief overall. As I was saying, sociologists have found it difficult to work out a so-called xenophobic profile in South Africa. In other words, to associate it with certain social groupings, or certain people with certain political affiliations, or certain racial groups, or what have you, for the simple reason that it's so widespread that it was impossible to do. So the variations of attitudes in these surveys between people was minimal. Okay? And if there was any group that was more xenophobic than others, it was white, retired DA supporters. That's all you can imagine. You can imagine. So they had kind of 0.2 on the scale more than everyone else. So the thing is that when it comes to attitudes, it's widespread throughout the country. And so it's not therefore a problem of the poor. The middle class in South Africa are xenophobic, at least measured by their attitudes, as as anybody else. And explaining this is not easy. And I think in order to be able to do so, we need to refocus our thinking to thinking politics. Politics understood as particular subjectivities, ways in which people think, ways in which people ask questions and find solutions. Presumably, if you think that you deserve a house or a job, you can go about claiming that in lots of different ways. You can organize for jobs. You can put pressure on the government in one form or another. So killing or excluding a foreigner is only one among a whole number of options. Why are these options the ones that people think of? And that is the problem. Well, that's the difficulty, making sense of this. And it seemed to me that there were two issues that needed to be addressed. One, on the one hand, how do we think xenophobia? And on the other hand, how do we think violence? Because it's not just xenophobia. And we're talking about xenophobic violence. In fact, xenophobia can exist among the population, but nobody seems to worry about it. It's only when it is expressed in the form of violence that everyone starts jumping up and down and saying, isn't it horrible? The rest of the time, you can be as xenophobic as you want. Okay? The fact that, for example, someone can go to the hospital and be refused treatment, and they are refused treatment systematically because they don't have an ID, is not something that's considered a crisis in this country. It's not something that is seen as being problematic. And that's extremely worrying. It's extremely worrying, not just for people who work in hospital, but I mean, what kind of society is it where someone, and I experienced this at first hand, some Mozambican guy came to see me and his arm was dangling down here, and he said they won't treat me in the hospital, a public hospital. So I had to go and find money to get him to get him treated. And that was extremely, he was quite lucky in this sense, because people get treated in all sorts of strange ways and they can't find the money. So, and then the fact of the matter is this society is called a democracy, or calls itself a democracy. And everyone agrees we have a democratic state, although sometimes the idea of a democratic state and democratic society are conflated. So you hear on the media, we live in a democratic society. Well, if you're a foreigner and you go to hospital and you want to be treated, it doesn't feel like you're living in a democratic society. So how is it that you can have such high levels of xenophobia in a country or in a state which calls itself a democratic state? Okay, so first I want to talk a little bit about xenophobia, and then I want to talk about violence, because I think the two are absolutely central to, or related to each other. Now, what kind of politics are we talking about? It seems to me, and I have written about this at some length, especially in this book which came out 2010, originally before that, but then it came out in 2010, after the 2008 pogroms, is that we're talking about a politics which is fundamentally a state politics. In other words, not all politics is a state politics. And I don't mean this simply that the state is the agent. It's perfectly possible for people, anyone, to engage in politics which are state politics. And the reason for this is that state politics are politics of power. They are politics which, at this particular moment, are founded overwhelmingly on identities, on identity politics. what is extraordinary is the way that the state can only seems to be able to think only the particular. And there is no universal conception of, for example, nation building, which has been an abysmal disaster in this country. There is no idea of the public good. There is no idea of the national interest, which differs, if you like, from public or private forms of accumulation. I'll come back and talk about that a little bit later on. So I think it should be apparent now, particularly, that the way power sees xenophobia, the issue of xenophobia, is to say that it is the migrants or the immigrants, the sending countries that are the problem. It doesn't see it as a problem of South Africans or the politics of the South African state. It is the problem of the other. The other is invading us. And the other gets constructed, as I will try and show a little bit, as the enemy. The idea of invasion, the idea of we're going to be smothered. For example, this is what Zuma Jr. said. We need to be aware that as a country we are sitting on a ticking time bomb of them taking over the country. It's extraordinary. Taking over the country. The language, I mean, it doesn't matter. I mean, this guy was obviously extreme, right? But you have less extreme versions of this. So they are going to take over. So they're an enemy, they're going to invade us. It's this constant language all the time. Okay? So I think we need to start from understanding where that comes from. And I think probably the place to start is by looking at xenophobia, is to start from the kind of comments that were made by people initially in the early 1990s, because it happened systematically in the early 1990s. And one of the most famous people in this regard was the first Minister of Home Affairs, who happened to be Mangosuthu Buthelezi. And he kept on going on about, you could kiss goodbye to the RDP, we're going to be invaded by all these Nigerians, they're a threat to our country. And although he was perhaps the most well-known and extreme, these kind of comments were made systematically by politicians at that time and continued. And they were reported in the press, and the press kept on going on and on about Nigerians coming up. It was Nigerians at the time, no? And switches. But in the 1990s, it was Nigerians who were all drug dealers. And they're here illegally. There's no evidence whatsoever to show that the numbers are always inflated. You know, oh, thousands of illegal immigrants coming, but when you try and measure it like a whole bunch of people have tried to measure, they found out, in fact, that the overwhelming number of foreigners in this country are here legally. It has nothing to do with the question of legality or illegality as such. I mean, we only need to be aware of how the restriction of visas and the restriction of entry for, for academics at this university and students at this university and middle-class professionals, the greater difficulties which they have to face at the moment in getting visas to come here, to realize that, in fact, it's not a matter of legality and illegality as such. There's even the issue now of the regulation of children having to carry full birth certificates. It's extraordinary. Extraordinary stuff. So they're talking about chaos at the airport because people are going to be arriving, you know, and where's your child's full birth certificate? And people don't know about this, so they're going to be sent back to where they came from. Anyway, so what was I saying? So what I was talking about is we have, from the 1990s onwards, a systematic discourse of exclusion towards foreigners. And the transformation of the setting up of legislation which is exclusionary, which continues in a sense the apartheid type of legislation by considering South Africa as a fortress to be defended. Fortress South Africa is the way it was said to be by a number of academics. So there have been a number of studies on the legislation, and all the legislation quite clearly follows the apartheid type of legislation in terms of being exclusionary. Insofar as statements of politicians are concerned, I mean, there was this Human Rights Watch report as early as 1998, which concluded that in general South Africa's public culture, this is a quote, has become increasingly xenophobic, and politicians often make unsubstantiated and inflammatory statements that the deluge of migrants is responsible for the current crime wave, rising unemployment, and even the spread of diseases. Okay, so even at one time AIDS was being brought from according to these statements. So we have, therefore, these statements by those in power regarding constructing foreigners or seeming foreigners, because it's not clear who's a Lekwerekwere and who's not. It's a stereotype. Makwerekwere can be someone who's slightly darker or slightly whatever, according to the stereotype. So once you start talking about exclusion, there's no way of controlling it, and it takes off. So the language of exclusion and blending was quite prevalent. The legislation is exclusionary. The exclusion from the healthcare system. It's interesting, the healthcare system, because even the most sensible ANC leaders, and I have spoken to a number of them, tend to say things like, our social welfare system is overburdened anyway. We're not going to be able to cope if all these foreigners come. It's not going to be able to cope, it will collapse. But they never produce any evidence to suggest that this is in fact, that foreigners are going to use the health system. In fact, a large number of South Africans go to traditional doctors because they can't even afford the health system. Or the health system is not available to them. So it's not at all clear whether in fact this conforms to some idea of reality or not. At the same time as all these discourses and practices are continuing, we have, of course, at the same time an idea of South African exceptionalism, which is prevalent in this country. The idea that Africa is we're not part of Africa, we're supposed to be some kind of island floating in the middle of the Atlantic. Africa is the other, somewhere else. It needs to be acted on, it has to be developed. It can be a place to go on holiday to see the real Africa. You've seen these things about the real Africa, and the real Africa is the so-called, the Big Five. Huh? So the real Africa is animals, it's not people, right? The image then is that South Africa is exceptional not just by its level of industrialization and development, but also because it's been so successful in achieving reconciliation, which it hasn't, as we know. But the idea that it achieves a transition which was non-violent, although that is questionable to a great extent, but at least. So even people like Desmond Tutu, who you wouldn't normally associate with African exceptionalists, spent a lot of time going on and about how the rest of the world is envying us because of our transition. You know, so we are somehow superior because we've managed to do things that no one else has been able to do. In addition, there's also this extraordinary thing in South Africa, if you come and you're a foreigner like me, that everything revolves around identity. The discourse is constantly about identity, whether it's racial identity, ethnic identity, national identity. You can't get anywhere if you don't have an ID. If you don't have, I mean, it took me quite some time to get the South African ID, and I struggled until I got one, but I wanted to resist it, but I couldn't. Even the machines say to you, sorry, we don't recognize your number because... So if you want to pay your bills, the machine, the program doesn't recognize your number because it has to be structured like an ID number. If it doesn't, and it's a passport number, it goes all funny. It says you can't do it. So identity from the subjective notion all the way to the fact, all the way to the state identity card governs the way we think politically all the time. And I believe that this is fundamentally the result of a failure of nation building. In post-independence Africa, the state was terrified of ethnic rebellions or tribal secessions or what have you. But it tried, of course it was coercive, it tried to coerce ethnic groups into submission. But it did try to build nations through some idea of national development. So there was something called national development. There was something called the nation which existed beyond all of us and to which we could all contribute towards development. There has not been in post-apartheid South Africa any serious attempt, I think, at nation building. And that is translated into a number of problems. A whole number of people feel excluded from the nation, and I'll come back to that in a minute, because of poverty, primarily. And therefore, outside the system of, we may call it outside civil society, and I'll try and explain why in a minute. So the failure to build a nation in the absence of some idea of some universal which we all are part of, there has been, and there always is under those circumstances, a tendency to emphasize the particular, the ethnic, the identity politics. And this is particularly so at the moment where we have people in power who are emphasizing one particular kind of identity, ethnic identity. It wasn't so under Thabo Mbeki because the ANC always had prided itself in being above identity, ethnic identities. But now Zuluness is particularly emphasized. The idea, the other point that needs to be made concerns the actions of what we used to call the repressive state apparatuses, in this particular case the police. the police have, I'll put it this way, Operation Fiela is not the first mass raiding of foreigners and others that has taken place in this country. There have been others before. But the government has always tended to respond to the issue of xenophobia by seeing it as a problem of people who are coming in illegally. Therefore, we have to kind of round them up and send them back. I won't even mention what happens at what's it called? Lindela camp, because that is run by a private company, subcontracted, and the way people are treated there are treated like as if they are in prison, even though they haven't committed any crime. Okay. But the police has always had that kind of power over people. I don't know if you know this, but police people, men and women, are only are promoted on the number of arrests they make, not on the number of convictions that result from the arrests. So it's in their interest to arrest as many people as possible, irrespective of whether that arrest is warranted or not. It's extraordinary, really. So, and it's very well known, they treat foreigners as if they are walking ATMs. They're called walking ATMs. In other words, you try and extort money from them as much as you possibly can. And that can involve the destruction of their papers when they have them. So it's not unknown that the police can tear up your papers when you've got them. So you become illegal by an arbitrary act of tearing up papers. It's extraordinary, and this happens. And many people have spoken about it. So the police are renowned. They can sit around when people are being robbed and not do anything, and just laugh. And they're given so much power to be able to stop people and ask for their IDs. So the literature says things like, because of the legislation and the atmosphere and the discourse of exclusion, what has happened de facto is a new pass system has developed. While we abolish the pass system, foreigners can be stopped and asked where their papers, the papers are, to produce them, even though in South African there's no legislation which obliges you to show your identification to any police. It's not a statutory obligation for anyone. So, what all this has produced is a culture of xenophobia by the state, and it has been seen as a legitimate way of looking at foreigners. So I should probably say the outsider rather than foreigners. I mean, one of the interesting things is that there's no way of telling who's a foreigner. As I said, it's a matter of stereotype. In 2008, you had to say elbow in Zulu, right? Otherwise, you wouldn't. I mean, I don't know what elbow in Zulu is. Yeah, no, I know you've told me already, but that would be cheating. I mean, because no, I have to have a Zulu friend with me, every time. Excuse me, what is it? So. So out of the 62 people who were killed in 2000, or 64 people who were killed in 2008, what was it? 11 people were South African. 20, yeah, sorry, 22, yes. 22, thank you for correcting me. More, yes, it was a third. Not a third, a third? Yes, a third. Now, It's basically the person who's not from here who's then turned into the outsider who's turned into the foreign, the enemy, the threat. Okay, so this basically gives us some idea of how a subjectivity, a political subjectivity of exclusion develops and has developed in South Africa. I want to mention a little bit now about violence. But talk about violence, though. In order to be able to first to understand the violence, we have to understand about not just exclusion, but the fact that the people who are excluded are seen as the enemy. In other words, the other is not just the other. I mean, you could have another, oh, poor, let's kind of be nice to them, they're weak and whatever. You could have a patronizing view of the other, but in this case, the other is the enemy, or the supposed enemy. And I think that is connected with the way in which the nation has come to be understood, I think. And the nation has, I think, come to be understood, as I said, not as an idea of the public good, the public interest. Citizenship, the idea of citizenship seems to be associated with entitlements. In other words, if you're South African, you're entitled. And that perspective of entitlement is one which has been fueled systematically, again by those in power, who have been accumulating resources on the basis of the fact that they are South African and therefore they're entitled to be empowered, as in be or bear, as we used to put. So people have, or the powerful, the elite, have stressed their blackness for empowerment purposes, not as a way of identifying with the rest of the continent so much, but as a way of empowering themselves economically and politically. And in this way, the national interest has been equated with private interest. It's in our interest to accumulate, and we're doing it on the basis of the fact that we are entitled because we are South Africans. Now, if the nation equals entitlement, and there are a lot of poor people who also see and adhere to this understanding of the nation as entitlement, they presumably also feel that they should get something out of the fact that they are South African. And what they want usually is housing, jobs, which they have been denied precisely by the capitalist system, which the elite are taking advantage of. So the fact of the matter is that the idea of entitlements, or the notion of citizenship as entitlement, is excluding the majority of the population. From the process, and they have not been included in the national in nation building. So, are we surprised then if so many poor people feel that they're entitled also to benefit from being citizens. And as a result, see non-citizens as threatening their access to housing, jobs, and so on. If we add to this, and this is where I want to begin to end, towards the end of what I'm going to say, the view that our understanding of how the state rules, it's important to understand and to try and study how the state in Africa rules, but particularly in our case, how the South African state rules. And the South African state has ruled in very interesting ways since the 1990s. I don't want to say since 1994, since 1990s. It hasn't ruled all sectors of the population in the same way. I think it's helpful to think in terms of what I call domains of politics and modes of rule, modes of state rule within those domains of state politics. One domain of rule can be called civil society. Or rather, one domain of politics, state politics can be called civil society. The way people are ruled within this domain of civil society is by considering them as citizens with rights, with full rights. So this applies overwhelmingly to the middle class. White, obviously, overwhelming, and the black middle class insofar as it exists. In this domain, people have the rights to go to right their wrongs. They have a right to rights, to use Hannah Arendt's expression. They have the right to exercise their rights. They can take people to court if they have been wronged. In this domain, these ideas are taken basically from Chatterjee, who follows Foucault in a particular way. In this particular domain, it is the right of property owners which is dominant. In other words, the rule of law dominates relations between state and people. So it is this particular domain of civil society which can be used to characterize the South African state as a democratic state. Here you have the rules, the regulations which govern the relations between state and people. If this police, for example, suspect that you may have engaged in some way breaking the law in one way or another, they'll come and knock on your door with a warrant from a judge and say, "Excuse me, please, do you mind if I come in and look and see if you have whatever?" So relations then between the police and the people who are ruled in this particular way is one which is governed by law and the rule of law. But we have to understand that especially, not exclusively, but in urban areas, there are other people who are governed in a different way. And that when people come and knock on their door, they just put the boot into the door and knock it down. In other words, the relations between power, in this case the police, and the people in this domain I call uncivil society, is not governed by the rule of law. These people are not considered to have the right to rights. They may have some, but they don't automatically conform to an idea that they have the right to rights. And they're not considered as having the right to rights necessarily. Rather, politics is thought in a different way. Not so much around rights of citizenship, but rather in terms of patronage, patron-client relations, which go along with the exercise of violence. because this is one of the things that happens if you are in a situation where the politics of patronage predominate. The way that these are usually enforced is through the use of violence, enforcers, and so on and so forth. So in what can be called uncivil society, which is governed by unfreedom, this is the term of Abakali Western Journal, unfreedom in that domain. You don't have the relationship between the state and the people based on the rule of law. In fact, you have to fight for the rule of law to exist all the time. So if any of you have seen the film Dear Mandela, you will notice that someone's shack is being smashed, and then the guy takes out the Constitution of South Africa and says, they don't have the right to do this without a court order and without having an alternative place for people to stay. So the law is systematically ignored and bypassed by state power all the time. Now, if we don't understand that distinction between two different domains of politics and two different forms of rule, we can't understand the fact that in one of these domains, violence is deployed as a matter of course, and is seen as a legitimate way of resolving contradictions. And this is the extraordinary thing. So you can have one space, if you like, one place, one domain of politics where the rule of law predominates, and then, everything follows the traditional conception of what democratic relations should be, and another where it doesn't. And the fact of the matter is that it's very rarely that those who live in the first know what happens in the second. The practices of the police are unknown, or at least people don't experience them directly, or if they do, they see them for a minute on television, and then you have an effect. The consequence is an affective reaction. So when you see people being dragged behind, this. Do you remember the story of the Mozambican guy being dragged behind the police vehicle, and you see it going, and you see it happening, and you think, oh, that's terrible. The guy dies, right, in the police cell afterwards. But then it's just like watching a movie. It doesn't really kind of have any impact whatsoever. So that's the problem with images, which is what I think we should be talking about at another time. So the point being then that these two domains of politics are of course intertwined, but it's very difficult to understand the other domain of politics if you live in the middle class areas, and if you are governed by the rule of law. So, in this way, a culture of violence can develop, can be produced in uncivil society. And this is what's been happening. The politics of patronage is precisely what has been happening in KwaZulu-Natal now for a long time. Not only in KwaZulu-Natal, but in other areas, but predominantly in KwaZulu-Natal for a long time. And that's why you have extremely high levels of violence in that province. And that's why when people like, what happens when people like Abaklali and others contest that violence, contest that mode of politics, and say, we want a completely different way of doing things, which does not distinguish between people from here, people from the Eastern Cape, Indians, you name it. When that happens, it's a threat to the politics of patronage and violence. And therefore, they are subjected themselves. They are therefore subjected themselves to violence, as happened in 2009. So I'm rounding up, I'm just finishing. I just want to list a few features of what I think where we're at, this kind of politics which seems to be dominant, it seems to be, it's difficult to name it, to characterize it. And naming is an important process. But what is this with politics that we seem to be confronted with, and that xenophobia is part of? What are some of its features in brief? One thing that I didn't mention is seeing opposition through conspiracies all the time. You know, I mean, the government, people in government always seem to think that there's a conspiracy, that we're being undermined, and that this conspiracy is often, there's got foreigners behind it. It's a foreign conspiracy. The enemy is seen everywhere. In fact, it was Zuma himself, which before Colloquium said, the enemies are within the party. It's an extraordinary statement to make. So the way you think differences is by thinking them the enemy is threatening you. Okay? So that's one feature. The other, because the other is seen as an enemy, then presumably the enemy has to be physically eliminated. And that's terrifying. What we're witnessing, as a number of commentators have said through this Operation Fiela, seems to be ethnic cleansing. And in some, this politics of power and identity seems to be directed by the state itself. I don't want to give it a name, although perhaps quasi-fascism would be the closest thing I could think of. And that's very worrying. Because we need to think seriously what happens when this starts to affect other people, not just foreigners, but when, for example, Indians in KwaZulu-Natal start to be seen as foreigners and start to be told to go back home. This is going to affect South Africans as well soon.